Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on a systematic literature review related to First Nations homelessness on and off reserve. The project is titled Endaamnaan, Home for All Nations, and is presented by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. My name is Jess Rumboldt. I use pronouns she and her. I am a postdoctoral fellow in Indigenous homelessness at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. I identify as having Mi'kmaq ancestry, and I'm on a pathway or path to exploring my own ancestry and familial connections. I grew up in the region of Peel, which is a part of the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I now reside on the traditional territory of Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutrals people. As part of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, I acknowledge that we are a settler organization. However, we are a leader in developing and promoting evidence-based strategies to prevent and end homelessness. We are pleased to be here with you today to discuss our work with the Assembly of First Nations to conduct a systematic literature review related to First Nations homelessness both on and off reserve. To provide a little bit of background about the COH, we partnered with agencies across Canada to produce a number of resources to help service providers, researchers, policymakers, and the general public to better understand solutions to homelessness. This work includes collaborative projects such as the Definition of Indigenous Homelessness in Canada, 2017, Revisioning Coordinated Access for Indigenous Communities, Fostering Best Practices Towards a Holistic Systems Approach to Homelessness, 2020, and the State of Homelessness in Canada, 2016, along with many other policy briefs and research reports that push forward-thinking solutions to end homelessness. Today's discussion is specifically on the systemic literature review that was conducted on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations. This project has two main deliverables, the first being literature summaries that were developed. The articles were attached to these summaries, as well as a final report that was co-created with the IAC, meaning the Indigenous Advisory Circle. Throughout this project, we took a phased approach. This means that the initial phases of the work continued to inform the preceding phases. A collaborative approach with members of the Assembly of First Nations and Indigenous Advisory Circle continued to play a key role in the process, as collaboration is essential to the success of this project. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this work continued to be conducted virtually, and we hosted meetings via Zoom, which provided an online and telephone-based access to our partners. The COH hoped that the literature review, and continues to hope that the literature review, will help inform the National First Nations Homelessness Action Plan. Directed by the Assembly of First Nations, this review is part of a larger initiative to establish a First Nations Homelessness Action Plan. The findings and recommendations were developed to reflect the reality of First Nations homelessness. This review synthesizes the existing literature on First Nations homelessness in a Canadian context. The Assembly of First Nations is a long-standing advocate for improving housing for First Nations peoples. The AFN envisions a society where all First Nations peoples living on or away from their community have a right to shelter and to be provided with an opportunity to access safe, secure, adequate, and affordable housing. In 2019, the AFN increased the scope of their work with a resolution from the Chiefs and Assembly, Resolution 79, 2019, titled The Action Plan for First Nations Homelessness on and Off Reserve. Today, the Assembly of First Nations portfolio includes the future development of a national First Nations homelessness strategy that is aligned with the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy. This literature review on First Nations homelessness aims to bolster the important work carried out by First Nations peoples. First Nations peoples have the right to exercise self-determination in providing care for their people, regardless of where they reside, and in increasingly searching for methods to do so that reflect First Nations peoples' inherent and treaty rights, title, and jurisdiction. Considering the disproportionate rate at which First Nations peoples experience homelessness on and off reserve, further research and advocacy is required to mobilizing long-lasting change. For the purpose of this review, the AFN initiative was to support the First Nations Action Plan through the systemic analysis of First Nations homelessness literature in Canada. This literature review identifies various gaps in research, influencing the need for First Nations specific recommendations to address homelessness. This literature review aimed to address the following 4 areas of inquiry. The first area of inquiry, understanding First Nations homelessness. We asked the question, how are the concepts of home and homelessness understood? How do First Nations descriptions differ from Western definitions of home and homelessness? What is the current state of First Nations homelessness in Canada? And what are the various forms of First Nations of homelessness? For inquiry number 2, this includes experiences of First Nations people's homelessness. We ask the questions, how do First Nations people experience homelessness? How do factors such as location, both on and off reserve, migration, gender, and age impact experiences of homelessness? Next, inquiry area 3 includes factors influencing homelessness. We ask the questions, why are First Nations peoples overrepresented in homelessness population? What are the root causes of this overrepresentation? How is homelessness for First Nations peoples connected to the legacy of residential schools, discrimination, colonization, intergenerational trauma, physical and mental health, and systemic racism and sexism? Lastly, inquiry number 4 included approaches to First Nations homelessness. This revolved around the questions of what solutions or preventative strategies are there to address homelessness for First Nations peoples, what works, and what are the innovative ways to better understand and address homelessness amongst First Nations peoples. Additionally, this literature review aimed to address research gaps and provide recommendations to rectify the disproportionate rate of homelessness that First Nations peoples in Canada experience. This literature review aims to unpack definitions of homelessness, experiences of First Nations homelessness, factors that influence First Nations homelessness, and approaches to addressing First Nations homelessness. There's a significant overlap throughout the themes discussed in this literature review, as experiences of homelessness are complex and interrelated. The aim of this review is to ensure that First Nations homelessness is increasingly prioritized by government and non-government bodies moving forward. This literature review may be of value to First Nations peoples, First Nations organizations, service providers, policymakers, government agencies, and community partners. Due to gaps in existing literature, there's much more work that needs to be done to thoroughly address these areas of inquiry. Prior to the start of this project, the COH met with the project team to define its objectives, methodology, project schedule, and expected outputs. During the objective settings meeting, the COH coordinated a schedule of meetings with the project team and confirmed ceremony plans. The COH also reviewed relevant information and reports as established by the Assembly First Nations. We then conducted a review of empirical and grey literature on emerging practices, service delivery models, and best practices related to First Nations homelessness and addressing it on and off reserve. We continue to conduct check-ins with the Indigenous Advisory Circle to discuss the literature and steps that have been taken throughout the process. This slide provides an overview of some of the various phases, the first starting with stakeholder engagement and information gathering, the next being literature review and data collection. This next slide also provides an overview of phase 3 and 4 of the project, the phase 3 being the literature review and analysis, and then phase 4 being the final reporting stage, with the knowledge and mobilization and dissemination of knowledge occurring this month, October 2021. As a settler organization, the COH understood that it could not conduct this work without proper engagement and collaboration with Indigenous communities. Along with regular engagement with members of the Assembly First Nations, we continued to tap into our network of Indigenous partners, the Indigenous Advisory Circle. To begin the project, we asked that the members of the IAC and an Indigenous elder guide us in ceremony to ensure that the work began in a meaningful way. This led to the naming of the project. Through engagements with the AFN and IAC, the keywords of the literature search were identified, as well as documents and reports that may exist outside the academic literature. Our project team also engaged with the IAC to interpret the findings in the literature review and develop recommendations based on the literature review. As the main deliverable, the literature review was based on our engagement with the Assembly First Nations and Indigenous Advisory Circle. The literature review was conducted using the identified keywords. We prioritized non-academic literature such as technical reports, position papers, internal and external evaluations, policy reviews, and news articles. A preliminary list of keywords included Indigenous homelessness, Indigenous housing, First Nations homelessness, First Nations housing, Indigenous support services, and First Nations support services. Additionally, we referred to updated information on Indigenous homelessness in Canada. Given that the COH is housed at York University, we also had access to an extensive number of academic peer-reviewed journals. We searched using the databases such as PsycInfo, Medline, and Google Scholar. The reference lists of the articles we selected were also reviewed and considered. From this search, we prioritized articles written by Indigenous scholars or written in collaboration with Indigenous communities. There are various literature review themes that we decided to look at going into the literature search. This included gender, age, location. And now you can see on this slide that each of these themes are broken down further. We also looked at the themes approaches to homelessness and understanding homelessness. So for instance, some of the things that we looked at in approaches to homelessness included the housing first approach, outreach and support, Indigenous-led services and programs, and services not being accessed. One of the key things to note is that while all of these themes were initially sought or looked at in the literature search, there were a substantial amount of gaps in the literature when it's focusing these specific themes just on First Nations. Lastly, another theme that we looked at was pathways to homelessness. So this included areas such as substance use, criminal justice system, employment, systemic racism and barriers, and public systems. When we look at the experiences represented in the themes, our objective here was to provide a space for voices. When we looked at genders, we were looking at literature presenting information on experiences of men, experiences of Indigenous women, and experiences of 2S LGBTQIA+. When looking at experiences related to age, we were searching for information on young Indigenous peoples, child welfare, families, elderly. When we looked at location, we looked at urban, rural, and migration patterns. And we noted that gender, age, location are more so centered on the experiences of an individual, community, family experiences compared to other themes, which look more into different broad interacting systems and pathways that causes of homelessness. There were several findings and conclusions that came from the literature review. This literature review provided a systematic analysis of First Nations homelessness in Canada. It addressed the following 4 areas of inquiry that is mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. The goal was to understand First Nations homelessness, but the overall finding is that there are significant gaps in the literature. For factors leading to homelessness, this literature review asked the questions why First Nations peoples were at such a high risk of experiencing homelessness. These inquiries all provided opportunities to present possible recommendations for a path forward. This literature review also addressed current gaps in research and provided recommendations for rectifying the disproportionate rate of homelessness amongst First Nations peoples in Canada. Understanding First Nations homelessness, experiences of First Nations homelessness, factors influencing First Nations homelessness, and responses to First Nations homelessness are fundamental in establishing a knowledge base from which informed solutions can be tailored to First Nations peoples and communities. Although there is an overlap in experiences of and solutions to homelessness between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, the recommendations discussed in this literature review will speak to the unique and distinct realities of homelessness amongst First Nations peoples. This literature review may be of interest to First Nations communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations, service providers, and this also provides an opportunity for governments and community partners to strive and work together to achieve housing conditions for First Nations that respect the dignity, autonomy, and security of First Nations peoples.